The instructor pointed at the target board 800 meters downrange and told the new arrival she had one shot to prove she belonged. She was 31, 5'5", and had been on the range for exactly 9 minutes. The wind was gusting crosswise at maybe 14 knots, the kind of shifting Santa Ana push that made every seasoned shooter on that firing line reach for their windage cards. She didn't reach for anything. She lay down behind the rifle, settled her cheek against the stock, and stayed still for what felt like a long time. Then she fired once. The spotter, a burly staff sergeant named Ridley who'd been running this range for 6 years, put his eye to the scope and went quiet. Dead center, not center of the black, center of the X. And Sabine Marsh hadn't even asked for the range card. If you've ever wanted to watch a room full of the most confident marksmen in the country slowly realize they'd underestimated someone, this is that story. Subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and drop your city in the comments right now. I genuinely want to see how far this one travels. Let's begin. The day Sabine Marsh reported to the Advanced Sniper Employment Course at the Army's Marksmanship Complex outside Fort Benning, Georgia, the sky had that washed-out white color that comes before real heat. She arrived in a rental sedan with Ohio plates, not the government transport most people expected, and she parked it crooked in a visitor slot because she'd been driving since before dawn and her back hurt. Nobody met her. She sat for a second with the engine ticking as it cooled, looking at the low brick buildings and the long green stretch of the ranges beyond, and she breathed in that smell every shooter knows: cut grass, gun oil, and the faint copper tang of spent brass baking in the sun. She'd smelled that her whole life, in one form or another. Her father had run a rifle range in rural Montana, a scrappy little operation with a plywood clubhouse and a wood stove. And Sabine had grown up doing her math homework on a bench between firing lanes while men twice her size argued about ballistic coefficients. She'd learned trigonometry before she learned to drive. She'd learned to read wind before she learned to read certain people. Inside the admin building, a young corporal at the desk looked up and did the small double take she'd gotten used to. He'd been told to expect a new instructor evaluator attached to the course, someone coming in from a program he didn't have the clearance to know about, and he clearly hadn't pictured her. "Ms. Marsh? That's me, Specialist Reyes, ma'am. Major Halloran wanted me to get you your credentials and your billeting assignment." He slid a folder across the desk. "First formations at 0600. The course cadre does their morning demo on range 4 at 08. Major said to tell you he'll want to see you before that." She took the folder without opening it and tucked it under her arm. "Thank you, Specialist." She found her quarters, dropped her bag on the bare mattress, and then, because she couldn't help it, she walked out to look at the ranges before the light went. She stood at the edge of range 4 in the failing gold of evening and looked downrange the way some people look at the ocean. She could see the target frames out at distance, could feel the shape of the terrain and the way the air moved through the little valley the range was built into. There was a cold front coming. She could feel it in the pressure. By tomorrow, the wind would be a problem, and it would be a problem the cadre had built their reputation on solving the hard way, by feel and experience and years of scars, and she already suspected they were going to hate the way she solved it instead. The thing you have to understand about long-range precision shooting is that it is not, at the highest level, an art. People love to call it an art, because that makes the mastery feel mystical, feel earned in the body, feel like something you can only get by putting rounds downrange until your instincts are tuned. And there's truth in that. But underneath the feel, underneath the calloused expertise, it is physics. It is a rifle round, leaving a barrel at roughly 2,700 feet per second, and immediately beginning to fall and to drift and to slow, while the earth itself turns beneath its flight path. Everything a great shooter does by instinct can also be done by mathematics, and the mathematics does not get tired, does not get rattled, does not have a bad morning. Sabine Marsh had spent her life learning to do both. Her problem, if you could call it that, was that she trusted the math more than most men in her profession would ever admit to trusting anything. The morning formation was exactly what she expected. 22 students, all men, most of them scout snipers and designated marksmen, sent here to sharpen skills they already considered elite, and the cadre, 4 senior instructors led by a master sergeant named Cutter Boyd, who had a reputation that arrived in the room before he did. Boyd had been shooting professionally for 19 years. He'd taught at 3 different schools. He was, by any honest measure, one of the finest field marksmen the Army had produced in a generation. And he knew it, and worse, he'd earned the right to know it. When Major Halloran introduced Sabine as an evaluator brought in to assess the course's methodology, Boyd's face did something very small and very cold, and Sabine caught it, and she understood immediately what the next several weeks were going to cost her. "An evaluator," Boyd said. "Not quite a question. Master Sergeant." She kept her voice level. "From where, if you don't mind my asking, a program that runs data analysis on engagement outcomes," she said. "I'm here to look at how the course teaches wind and range estimation." "That's all. That's all," Boyd repeated, and a couple of the younger cadre smiled, because they'd learned to smile when Boyd's voice went flat like that. "You shoot, Ms. Marsh?" "Some." That was the moment. She'd said some, the way a person says it when the honest answer would sound like bragging, and Boyd heard it as false modesty, as a civilian analyst trying to sound humble, and he decided in that instant that he was going to put her on a rifle in front of his students and let the wind teach her the lesson he thought she needed. That was the point of the 800-meter shot. It wasn't a test. It was supposed to be a humiliation. He picked the worst possible time of morning, the crosswind at its most treacherous, and he handed her a rifle she'd never fired, a weapon zeroed for someone else's eye, and he did not give her the data card, and he watched with his arms crossed and his jaw set, waiting. And Sabine Marsh lay down behind the rifle and closed her eyes for a second and did the thing she'd been doing since she was 9 years old on her father's range. She read the flags. She read the mirage boiling off the grass. She felt the pressure and the temperature and the humidity on her skin the way you feel weather in your joints. And then, and this is the part nobody watching could see, she ran the numbers, not roughly, precisely. 2,000 feet of drop compensation, a wind hold she calculated to the 10th of a mil by solving in her head an equation most of these men had never learned to solve on paper. She adjusted for the unfamiliar rifle by watching how Boyd himself had carried it, judging its zero from the wear pattern on the turret, a guess, but an educated one. And she fired once, center of the X. The silence that followed was the kind you could stand inside. Ridley, the spotter, looked up from the scope and didn't say the number out loud because saying it felt like a betrayal of his own master sergeant. Boyd walked to the scope himself. He looked. He straightened up slowly, and Sabine got to her feet, brushed the grass off her sleeves, and handed him the rifle stock first. "Your zero's about 1/4 mil left, Master Sergeant," she said quietly, so the students couldn't hear. "You've been holding for it without noticing. It's in the wear on your turret." She wasn't trying to embarrass him. She was telling him something true about his rifle because that's what you did with true things. But Boyd's face closed like a door, and Sabine understood that she just made an enemy out of a good man, and that the making of it hadn't been her choice. Major Halloran called her into his office that afternoon. He was a lean, gray man with the tired patience of an officer who'd spent his career mediating between talented people who couldn't stand each other. He had her file open on his desk, or the parts of it he was allowed to see. "That was a hell of a shot," he said. "It was arithmetic, sir. Boyd doesn't think of it as arithmetic." "I know. That's the problem I'm here to look at." Halloran leaned back. "I'll be honest with you, Marsh. I read what I could of your record. There's a lot of it I can't read. But the part I can read tells me you spent 4 years attached to a targeting cell that did things I'm not cleared to know about, and that your engagement calculations were accurate to a degree that made some very senior people either very happy or very nervous, depending." He paused. "You know why you're really here? To evaluate the course. The course is fine. The course produces excellent shooters." He tapped the desk. "What the course does not do is produce shooters who can teach a machine to do what they do. And the future of this whole business, whether Boyd likes it or not, is going to involve machines doing a lot of the reading that men like him do. I feel somebody upstairs wants to know if the human expertise can be captured, quantified, taught to a system. They sent you because you're the rare person who can do it by feel and explain it by number." He looked at her steadily, Boyd is the best field shooter I've ever seen. You're going to have to work with him, and he is going to fight you every single day because what you represent looks to him like the end of everything he is." Sabine was quiet for a moment. "It's not the end of what he is," she said. "It's the only way to keep it. If nobody writes down what he knows, it dies with him." "You might try telling him that." "I might," she said. "He won't hear it, not yet." She was right. He wouldn't. The days that followed settled into a hard rhythm. Sabine would attend the cadre's instruction in the mornings, taking notes in a small waterproof pad, and she would say very little. She watched Boyd teach, and the truth was that watching him teach was like watching a great musician who couldn't read sheet music. He knew things. He knew, standing at the firing line, that a shot would drift a hand's width before the round even left the barrel. And he was right. And he could not have told you why in any language that could be written down and handed to another person. He taught by demonstration and by osmosis and by yelling, and the students who had the gift absorbed it and the students who didn't washed out, and Boyd considered that a feature, not a flaw. The washing out was the point. It was how he'd been made. And Sabine sat in the back and watched a young corporal named Emmett Doss struggle. Doss was maybe 23, a farm kid from Nebraska, with steady hands and a good eye, and he was drowning. Not because he lacked talent, but because he couldn't learn the way Boyd taught. He needed the why. He needed to understand the mechanism before his hands could execute it, and Boyd's method, the method of feel and demonstration and impatience, was leaving him further behind every single day. Sabine watched him miss a shot he should have made, watched Boyd shake his head and move on, watched the kid's ears go red, and something in her chest tightened in a way she recognized. She'd been that kid once, on her father's range, before her father had figured out that she needed the numbers to make the feel make sense. She found Doss cleaning his rifle alone that evening, sitting on an ammo crate behind the armory with his shoulders around his ears. "You're pulling low left under time pressure," she said, not as a question. He looked up, startled. "Ma'am?" "When Boyd puts you on the clock, you're anticipating the recoil and you're breaking your wrist a half-second before the shot. It's not your wind calls. Your wind calls are actually good." She sat down on the crate next to him. "Can I show you something?" She spent 40 minutes with him. Not shooting, talking. She drew the physics of it on the back of his data book, the way the recoil impulse traveled, the exact moment the round left the muzzle relative to the moment his brain thought it did. She gave him a number to hold in his mind, a rhythm, a count. She turned the mystical thing Boyd taught into a sequence Doss could actually execute. And the next morning, on the clock, under pressure, Doss put 5 rounds into a group you could cover with a playing card, and he turned around with a look of such raw astonishment that Sabine had to look away to keep from grinning. Boyd saw it. Boyd saw all of it. And Boyd said nothing, which was worse than if he'd said something. The conflict didn't come to a head over a person. It came to a head over a machine. Halfway through the course, the school received a piece of equipment for evaluation, a ballistic computation system, a ruggedized unit that could take atmospheric readings and range data and produce a firing solution in under a second. It was the future Halloran had talked about, made physical, sitting in a hard case on a table in the classroom. And Boyd looked at it the way a blacksmith might look at the first factory that was going to put him out of business. "That thing," he said to the assembled students, "will get you killed." He said it with total conviction, and the students who worshipped him wrote it down like scripture. And Sabine, sitting in the back, felt the whole reason she'd been sent narrow to a single point. "It'll get you killed," Boyd went on, "because it teaches you to trust a box instead of your own eyes. And the day that box freezes up, or the battery dies, or the readings lie to you, you'll have forgotten how to do the one thing that keeps you alive out there, which is think." He looked directly at the back of the room, at Sabine, for the first time in the whole speech. There are people who believe a computer can replace a shooter. Those people have never been shot at. It was a good speech. It was in its bones, even correct. And it was also the exact wrong lesson. And Sabine knew she had to answer it. And she knew that answering it in front of his students would cost her the last shred of goodwill she'd built. And she stood up anyway. "Master Sergeant, may I?" Boyd gestured at the room with an open hand, a magnanimous invitation that was also a trap. "Go ahead, Hang yourself. Sabine walked to the front. She didn't touch the machine. She stood beside it. He's right, she said, and she watched the students' faces flicker with confusion because they'd expected her to defend the box. Everything he just told you is right. A machine you don't understand will get you killed. A shooter who trusts a solution he can't check is a liability. All true. She let it sit. But here's what he didn't say, and I don't think he'd disagree with it. This box doesn't know anything Master Sergeant Boyd doesn't already know. It can't. Everything in it was put there by people. The drop tables, the drag models, the wind algorithms, every line of it is somebody's expertise written down. She picked up the unit then and held it up, not like a weapon, like an exhibit. This isn't the enemy of what he teaches. This is a photograph of it. And the reason I'm here, the actual reason, is that Master Sergeant Boyd is one of maybe a dozen men alive who can read wind the way he reads it. And when he retires, that knowledge is going to walk out the door with him unless somebody writes it down. This box is how you write it down. The room was dead silent. Boyd's jaw was tight. The question, Sabine said, quieter now, isn't whether you trust the box or trust the man. It's whether you can be the kind of shooter who understands the math well enough to know when the box is lying to you. Because someday it will lie to you. And on that day, the man who knows the physics survives, and the man who only knows how to punch buttons dies. He's teaching you to survive that day. I'm just telling you there's a name for what he does, and the name is mathematics, and you're allowed to learn it. She set the box down and went back to her seat. Nobody moved. And Boyd, standing at the front of his own classroom, looked at her with an expression she couldn't read and dismissed the class early. The reckoning came at the end of course qualification, and it came the way these things always come. Through pride and a bad decision made in front of people who mattered. A general officer was visiting, a 2-star from Training and Doctrine Command, who was going to decide, based partly on what he saw that day, whether the ballistic computation program got funded and expanded across the whole school system. Boyd knew it. Everyone knew it. And Boyd, whether from conviction or something more wounded, decided to prove his point in front of the general by setting up a qualification course of fire so brutal that no computed solution could keep up with it. Rapidly changing targets at unknown distances, engineered specifically to reward feel and punish calculation, and he put Corporal Doss on the line to shoot it. With the box, in front of the general. It was cruel and it was clever. Doss was the student most identified with Sabine's methods, the kid she'd taught, the walking proof of her approach, and Boyd was going to let him fail with the machine in his hands and let everyone draw the conclusion. Doss knew it too. Sabine watched the color drain out of the kid's face as he understood what he'd been set up to do. She crossed the range and stood beside the firing line, not dramatically, just present. Master Sergeant. Her voice was level and it carried. This course of fire has targets at unknown distance with a 4-second exposure. The equipment isn't rated for that engagement window. Putting a student on it with the system is setting him up to fail, and I think you know that. The general's head turned. Boyd looked at her. You said the box was a photograph of what I do. So let's see the photograph shoot. The box was never meant to shoot this, she said. Neither is Corporal Doss, alone on his 4th week. But I'll tell you what I'll do. She turned to the general. Sir, with your permission, let Corporal Doss shoot it his way. With the calculation he's been taught, checked against his own read. And let me shoot the same course of fire, cold, with the machine turned off. Same targets, same wind. If the point of this is to find out whether the math and the feel are enemies, let's actually find out. The general, who had not gotten to be a general by turning down a good demonstration, said, do it. Doss shot first, and the kid from Nebraska, terrified, drowning in the weight of what was riding on him, steadied himself using the count Sabine had given him, the rhythm, the number, and he made his read, and he checked it against the machine. And where they disagreed, he trusted his own eyes, because that was what she'd taught him, and he shot a qualifying score. Not a perfect one, a qualifying one. Under pressure that would have broken most men in that room, and Boyd watched the kid he'd tried to sacrifice hold himself together with exactly the tools he'd argued would get people killed, and something moved behind the Master Sergeant's eyes. Then Sabine shot. Cold, no machine, unknown distances, 4-second windows, And she was not better than Boyd would have been. She'd have told you that herself and meant it. But she was very, very good, and every shot she made, she called out loud before she fired. The range and the wind hold, the whole solution spoken clearly, so the general and the students and Boyd could hear that there was no magic in it. Only a mind moving fast through numbers it had practiced 10,000 times. She missed one. She called her own miss before the spotter could. That one's low. I rushed the wind. And then she made the rest. When it was over, the range was quiet again. That same standing silence, and the general turned to Boyd and asked him, straight, what he made of it. And here is where a lesser man would have doubled down. Boyd was not a lesser man. That was the thing Sabine had understood about him from the beginning and never stopped respecting. He was proud, and he was stubborn, and he was afraid, in the specific way that skilled people fear their own obsolescence. But underneath all of it, he was honest, and he'd spent his whole life around a discipline that punishes dishonesty with failure you can measure in inches. Boyd looked at the targets. He looked at Doss, still shaking with adrenaline. He looked at Sabine. I think, he said slowly, that I've been teaching half of it. He turned to the general. Sir, I've spent 19 years telling shooters to trust their gut. And I was right, mostly. But I've been letting good kids wash out because they needed the other half, the half I could never explain, and she can. He stopped, and the admission cost him something visible. If we don't write down what the old hands know, it dies with us. She said that to me a month ago, and I didn't want to hear it. I'm hearing it now. The general funded the program. That was the outcome that mattered to the people upstairs, the line in a report. But it was not the thing Sabine carried with her when she loaded her crooked parked rental sedan a week later and pointed it back toward wherever the next assignment was. The thing she carried was a conversation. Boyd had found her the last evening, out at the edge of Range 4, where she liked to stand and read the coming weather, and he'd stood next to her for a while without saying anything. Two people who understood the same landscape from opposite ends of it. And then he'd said, not looking at her, my father taught me to shoot, never wrote down a word of it. When he passed, I realized there was stuff he knew that I'd never asked about, and now nobody will ever know it again. He'd been quiet a moment. I don't want to be that. I've got 22 kids a year, and most of them, the good ones, they learn what I know. But the ones like Doss, he'd shaken his head. I was losing them, and I told myself they weren't good enough. That was a lie I liked because it was easier than admitting I couldn't teach them. You can teach them, Sabine had said. You've got more to teach than anyone I've met. You just needed a second language. Math, Boyd had said and almost smiled. My old man would have hated that. My old man loved it, she'd said. He ran a range in Montana, taught me trig between firing lanes. I think that's the only reason I can do both. I never got to choose between the feel and the number. I grew up with the feel and the number holding hands. They'd stood there a while longer. The front had come in, the pressure dropping, the wind picking up across the grass, and both of them had read it without a word. One by feel, one by number, arriving at the same truth from different directions the way they always would. What stays with a person at the end of a thing like this is rarely the demonstration, or the score, or the general's decision. Sabine Marsh had come to Georgia with a rental car and no welcome, and a reputation she couldn't fully explain to anyone without a clearance most people didn't have. She'd come to do one thing, not to beat Cutter Boyd, not to win over his students, not to prove that machines were better than men, because they weren't and never would be. She'd come to save something, to take the knowledge that lived in the hands and eyes of extraordinary people and make sure it didn't die when they did. To build a bridge between the way things had always been done and the way they were going to be done, and to convince the men on the old side of that bridge that crossing it wasn't a betrayal of everything they were. It was the only way to make it last. The rifle doesn't care whether you love it or fear it, whether you learned it from your father or from a book. It obeys the same physics for everyone. The round falls at the same rate for the master sergeant with 19 years and the corporal in his 4th week. The wind pushes the humble and the proud exactly alike. And in the end, the shooters who last are not the ones who trust only their gut or only their numbers, but the rare ones who learn to hold both at once and listen to what the world is actually telling them, which is always, if you're quiet enough to hear it, the truth. Sabine had known that since she was 9 years old, doing her math homework on a bench between the firing lanes while the men argued. The wind had been telling the truth the whole time. All anyone ever had to do was learn how to read it, in whatever language they had.